Every living being, be it flora or fauna, needs a supply of food for its survival. Living beings need food for the purposes of growth, movement, and reproduction because it is food that provides living beings with energy for every action. The sequential links among living beings for food is called the food chain. The energy produced by the sun is locked by the primary producers, that is, plants, by the process of photosynthesis. Through food chain, this energy is transferred through different levels of fauna which are an important part of the ecosystem. The primary consumers, that is, the herbivorous, consume plants and the secondary consumers, that is, carnivorous, consume the herbivorous. In food consumption, there is transformation of it into energy. Waste produced at each level is decomposed by scavengers and detritivores. Ecosystem, which is made up of abiotic, that is, non-living as well as biotic, that is, flora and fauna components, requires the transformation and transfer of the energy. There is insufficient energy transfer through food chain, that is, energy level available at the level of producers gradually lessens with movement up the chain, leading to a pyramid of energy. So, some energy is actually lost during transfer of energy to higher levels. On the other hand, the nutrients needed by living beings for healthy life is actually recycled within the ecosystem. Food chains use up energy for reproduction, growth, and other activities. This used up energy is absorbed by ecosystem. In general, shorter food chains retain a greater amount of energy than longer food chains do. Food chains and food webs. Living beings eat food and need energy. The food that is consumed by living beings is converted into energy. This energy is used by the organisms for different activities needed for growth and survival, movement, etc. Energy is released when the food that is eaten passes through the body and is digested. Food chain is a simple representation of the linear links of the different biotic components starting from the producers, that is, plants to be the decomposers. How a living being gets its food is shown in a food chain. Plants use energy from the sun for the process of photosynthesis, which is simply described as the process of food preparation in plants using water and carbon dioxide. Herbivorous or primary consumers eat these plants, while secondary consumer or carnivorous eat other animals. A food chain, for example, can link grass, the deer dependent on grass, and the tigers which eat deer. Each component in the chain is the food for the higher level component. A food chain always starts with plants as they can prepare their own food using photosynthesis. Animals cannot prepare their own food, so they have to primarily depend on plants or maybe on other plant-eating animals. That is why plants are called producers and animals are consumers. Animals eating plants are herbivorous or primary consumers. Animals eating herbivorous are carnivorous or secondary consumer. Carnivorous eating other carnivorous are tertiary consumers. Omnivorous eat both animals and plants. There are also decomposers as well as in the chain. These decomposers such as fungi and bacteria feed on dead and decaying matter and help to speed up the process. This releases mineral salts for the absorption by plants in the form of nutrients. However, a food chain is just a theoretical representation of the links. In reality, there are several links amongst the different biotic components. So there is no single chain. In fact, each food chain overlaps several others and is actually just a part of a much wider picture of links among the different components in different trophic levels. So, it can be said that the plants, animals, and organisms are parts of the food web, and each food chain is a part of a food web. A food web contains many food chains, all of which are connected to each other. Like a food chain only represents a single way in which plants and some animals are a part of a particular chain. A food web actually shows the number of different ways in which different plants and animals are connected to or dependent on each other. In food chain, energy passes from one link to the other of the higher level, while food web shows that energy can move from any component to the other. Most food chains do not have more than 4 to 5 links, whereas in case of food webs, the links are innumerable, proving that most animals are part of many food chains and are dependent on more than just one source of food to meet the requirements of energy. So, the food web is formed by interconnected chains. Stages of food chain. Every food chain starts from plants and ends in an animal. There are also several stages in between. Primarily, energy that passes through the food chain is provided by the sun. Plants take this energy from the sun and convert this into glucose. It requires water and carbon dioxide for the process of photosynthesis and also produces oxygen in the process. This glucose increases the nutritional value of plants for animals. Thus, with water, carbon dioxide and sunlight, plants can prepare their own food. Plants are the primary producer. They make up the first stage of the food chain. Plants form the first stage of the food chain. They are the only components that are able to convert the energy available in the environment into consumable and transferable form. No animal can perform the feat of preparing its own food. Plants are the manufacturer of food and the resources of energy which otherwise is available only in the environment. So, to transfer this energy through the food chain, plants are consumed by certain animals. So, plants are called the producers, while animals are referred to as consumers. The animals which eat plants, that is, the primary producers, are called herbivores. They make up the primary consumers and form the second stage. The herbivores eat plants and get some of the energy from the plants. It uses part of the energy for growth, movement, reproduction, etc. Some of the energy is lost through the process of respiration. For example, in a simple food chain, a deer, a giraffe, or a goat may be the link that serves as the secondary stage of the food chain. Herbivores are purely dependent on plants for their food and therefore the supply of energy. Herbivores serve as the food and source of energy for a certain level of animals. Animals that live on other animals are called carnivores. Carnivores make up the third stage of the food stage. However, carnivorous animals are not solely dependent on herbivores for food. They may feed on other carnivores as well. Carnivores that solely depend on herbivorous animals for food and energy source are called the secondary consumer. For example, animals like birds that live on herbivorous insects are all secondary consumer. The secondary consumers get their energy from eating the herbivores. They, too, like herbivores, use the energy for growth, reproduction, movement, and all activities necessary for survival. The secondary consumers serve as the source of food to the other carnivores called the tertiary consumers. Tertiary consumers are carnivores that feed on other secondary consumers and derive energy, some of which is used by them, while the other part of the energy is lost in the process of respiration. Example, snakes that eat birds. They are the source of food and energy for other carnivores, called the quaternary consumers. Example, mongoose feeding on other carnivorous snakes. The fourth stage of the food chain is composed of decomposers like fungi or bacteria, which of speeding up the process of decomposition of waste provides nutrients into the soil to be consumed by the plants. Food chain as a pyramid. Plants derive energy from the sun and convert it to glucose. Animals feed on plants and use the energy, and more animals feed on such animals, and so on. Thus, energy is transferred with movement up the food chain. However, the total energy that is derived does not get converted or transferred. That is, the efficiency is never 100%. A part of the energy is lost at each stage of the food chain. This dissipation takes place ultimately as heat into the environment. So, the total energy received or stored by a certain trophic level is less than that of the lower level. Thus, the gradual decrease in the amount of energy transferred to the higher trophic levels is represented as the pyramid of energy. Some of the ingested materials like fat-soluble pesticides do not dissipate into the environment, and their concentration increases in the living tissue while passing through the trophic levels. Organisms are composed of organic molecules of similar nature and proportions. Therefore, it can be concluded that the energy contained by them is roughly equal to their dry weight. The product of multiplying the census of a population and the average weight gives the approximate weight of the population and is called the biomass, also known as the standing crop. It decreases with movement up the food chain from the autotrophs that are responsible for making the organic molecules in the first place. There are two structures of biomass pyramids. The squat biomass pyramid is one in which the efficiency of conversion between two different trophic levels higher up is about 10% or more on an average. On the other hand, the tall and skinny pyramid is one in which this efficiency of conversion is less than 10%. When the various ecosystems are analyzed, the results obtained indicate clearly that the tall and skinny pyramids are more likely to be disrupted by biotic or physical changes than the squat pyramids are. Studies show that the population of the animals that are smaller in size is greater than that of animals which have larger sizes. This can contribute to a special kind of pyramid called the pyramid of numbers. If the census of populations of different autotrophs, herbivorous and carnivorous of an area is taken, the resultant figures is most likely to show that the number of individuals making up each link of the food chain gradually decreases, thus forming a pyramid. This kind of a pyramid is due to many reasons. The trophic level of a species limits the total biomass of the species. Therefore, if the number of the individuals in a trophic level is found to be large, the size of the individuals might be small and vice versa. According to general observations, the predators are larger in size than the prey. These predators occupy a higher trophic level and their biomass is observed to be smaller. Hence, it can be said that the number of predators is much smaller than that of the prey, hence forming a pyramid in the food chain. Understanding the ecological niche. The term niche in ecology describes the way of a species' life. Each species has a unique niche. The way an organism or any population of it responds to distribution of resources and competitors and how these factors are altered by the species is described by ecological niche. Most species live in a typical ecological niche. However, there might be some expectations as well, like in case of kiwi bird, known to feed on worms and ground creatures and exist in the niche of mammals. For example, An organism responds to abundance in resources and scarcity of predators, pathogens and parasites by growing. It alters the same factors by limiting competitors' access to its resources and also by checking its service as a food source to its predators. Joseph Grinnell, for the first time in 1917, used the term niche in the context of ecology in his paper. The niche of a species, according to him, is determined by the habitat in which it exists. That is, the niche refers to the total requirements from the habitat or environment to survive and reproduce. This theory allows the possibility of ecological equivalence as well as empty niche. According to the theory stated by British ecologist Charles Sutherland Elton, the term niche is actually the role that is played by a species in the community instead of the habitat. This is considered as the first working definition of the concept of niche. Zoologist G. Evelyn Hutchinson in 1957 developed another new theory about niche concept by viewing niche as a hypervolume with dimensions which are resources and conditions required by an individual or a population in the environment. During his quest to find the reason behind the existence of a large number of species in a single habitat. The fundamental niche is when an organism can survive and reproduce without any interference from other species and hence use the biotic and abiotic conditions and resources to the full extent. However, a species is usually forced to exist in a much narrower niche as a result of interspecific competition and interaction. They are usually more adapted to this niche, which is called the realized niche or hypervolume. It defines the dimensional space of resources available to organisms and specifically used by them. George Gaylord Simpson first used the term adaptive zone to define a set of ecological niche occupied and exploited by a group of species in a similar way. The difference between Hutchinson and Grinnell are very subtle. Different species cannot share the same niche but can share a particular mode of life. Once a niche becomes empty, this vacant space can be filled by other organisms. Besides, when animals and plants get introduced to a new environment, they have the capability to invade and capture the niche of resident organisms. They often outcompete the native species. When non-indigenous species get introduced to non-native habitats, it may lead to biological pollution by invasive species or exotic species. The mathematical representation of a species' fundamental niche in ecological space and its subsequent projection back into geographic space is the domain of niche modeling. Effects of environmental change on food chain and food web. There are a lot of man-made changes that the nature has to deal with, including poaching and deforestation. There is also a chain reaction of other climatic changes like rise in seafall level or change in rainfall pattern. Global warming may be considered one of the greatest causes of extinction of species, as most ecosystems will be struggling if there is a rise of the global temperature by 3 degrees Celsius. The climatic changes are having their impact upon all major ecosystems like forests, water, polar regions, etc., and are deeply influencing the inhabitant animals by attacking their food, drinking water, suitable climate, etc. While some animals cope, others are less likely to be able to survive in the face of major changes. The climatic changes are expected to pose major threats to the biodiversity and become one of the primary factors having a hazardous impact on the health and well-being of living beings, including humans, in the near future. There will be rearrangement of the existing distribution of climatic conditions. across the world in the current century itself. As a result, living organisms will be expected to adapt to the new and fast changing conditions. Climatic changes will have profound effect on ecosystem functioning, community organization and dynamics. Different latitudinal zones support portions of the world's biological diversity with climatic changes. There are population movements and all the zones of the world are affected by these. Some species have narrow habitat tolerance and may also have low dispersal ability. Such species are at high risk when faced with climatic changes. Worldwide impacts of recent climatic conditions have already been recorded and have led shifts in phenology, distribution and behavior of species. Many species have to migrate to higher latitudes or elevation due to warming. But at higher levels, the temperature or weather conditions might hardly be conducive for their survival. Again, with a rise in the level of seawater, the salt water may intrude the fresh water system, forcing many species to relocate, adapt, or simply die due to the inability to do either. Such changes in the habitat remove predators that are important to the food chain. When put in a different way, this shows that for the predators, their prey, that is, food is taken away from them. Movements to higher elevations have already been observed, and there have been changes in the composition of community at the higher levels. Different spatial and temporal responses by separate taxonomical species may lead to mismatched interaction among them, which take place at different speeds. As species expand ranges, differential range expansion will most likely affect the structure and dynamics of the food webs in which these species have their niche. One of the traits of these range expanding species can be their size, owing to the relationship of animal metabolism to its role in the structure of food web and community organization. The position of these species in the food chain also explains the success of the expansion. Thus, with climatic changes, species change their habits or fail to survive, thus displacing themselves in the food chains. For example, in a simple food chain, a deer feeds on grass and tiger feeds on this deer. If deer becomes extinct, then the gap between tiger and grass cannot be bridged. Conclusion. Every organism has its own important role to play in the ecosystem. That is what ties every component together. Energy exists in the nature in a form that cannot be observed and used by animals. So, plants are needed to capture this energy and convert it to the form that can be used by animals. Some of the energy is used by animals for growth, movement, reproduction, etc., while some of it is wasted. Though the dependence of one organism upon the other for food can very simply be described with the help of a linear food chain, in reality, there are many food chains. They all are interlinked to form the food web, where one organism can be the predator of many organisms of different trophic levels. In ecosystem, different pyramids can be formed, keeping in mind the decreasing energy, the biomass and the population. These pyramid structures contribute sufficiently to the ideas of food chains and food webs. The existence of an organism in a particular environment, its contribution and activities in such an environment determines its niche. There are different theories about ecological niche, all of which ultimately say that different species can only share a niche but not coexist in one. Invasion of one niche by a non-indigenous species can lead to biological pollution. One of the reasons for such biological pollution is the rapidly changing climate. Species are required to adapt the changes or to relocate, or they must die. This brings a change in the food chains and hence food webs.